Settle into where you are now. Let the present moment loosen its grip just a little and allow your thoughts to drift far beyond clocks and calendars. We are going to a landscape of low hills and open skies in southeastern Anatolia, in what is now modern Turkey, where wind still moves easily across the stone. The time is around 10,000 BC, long before cities, long before writing, long before fields laid out in neat rows. This is a world without permanent villages as we know them, yet not without memory or meaning. Here, people once gathered at places that required effort, coordination, and shared purpose. One of those places, Göbekli Tepe, was eventually closed. Not destroyed in haste, not abandoned in panic, carefully, deliberately filled in with earth and stone. Tonight we are not focused on its rise, but on what followed. On the quieter question of how human life continued once such centers faded from use. What happens when a shared place of gathering is gently left behind, and daily life must carry meaning on its own? This is a story not of endings, but of redistribution. The careful closing of Göbekli Tepe did not signal a rupture in human life. It marked a pause, a reorientation, a gradual turning of attention away from a single focal point and back toward many smaller ones. Before farming, before permanent villages, before monuments returned in other forms, human life continued, steady and unannounced. It is possible you may want to return to this kind of story again, and if so, you are welcome to subscribe, simply as a way of keeping these quiet journeys connected over time. Within the first moments after such a place was no longer used, nothing dramatic would have been visible. Families still woke with the light. Tools still wore down and were reshaped. Paths across the land were still remembered by feet rather than maps. The closing of a large ritual center did not erase knowledge. It redistributed it. Before stone circles, before carved pillars, before collective gatherings drew people from miles away, meaning already lived in gestures, in repeated movements, in shared meals and seasonal rhythms. Göbekli Tepe concentrated these things for a time, but it did not create them. When the site was filled in, those practices did not vanish. They thinned out across the landscape. Rather than collapse or advance, communities appear to have gently dispersed. Smaller groups spent longer stretches apart, meeting less often in grand settings, but remaining connected through memory and kinship. The land itself became the organizer again. Water sources, animal migrations, and familiar hills regained their quiet authority over movement and timing. This dispersal likely changed how stories were told. Without a central place to return to, memory may have leaned more heavily on people rather than stones. Knowledge traveled through voices, through demonstration, through the slow patience of watching elders work. Ritual did not end. It softened, becoming less visible to us, but no less present to those living it. Agriculture, often treated as a sharp dividing line, did not suddenly replace this way of life. Tending plants and managing landscapes had already begun in subtle forms. These practices could expand slowly, fitting into existing routines rather than overturning them. Daily life absorbed change without ceremony. What followed Göbekli Tepe was not an empty space in history. It was a quieter one, and in that quiet human continuity found new shapes, grounded less in monuments and more in the steady repetition of ordinary days, which leads us to consider how meaning survives when it is no longer anchored to stone. That steadiness of ordinary days, carrying meaning without stone anchors, invites us to look more closely at how human life reorganizes itself when large gathering places fall silent. Not by decision or decree, but through countless small adjustments that leave little trace for us to find. What appears quiet in the archaeological record may, in lived experience, have been full and textured. As people moved less frequently toward a single, shared destination, their sense of place likely became more layered. Instead of one center, there were many familiar points across the land. A sheltered slope where game often passed, a stand of trees known for good wood, a seasonal camp remembered not for its monumentality, but for the way light fell at a certain time of year. These were not new discoveries. They had always existed. What changed was how much attention they received. The absence of a large ritual center did not remove structure from life. It altered where structure resided. Social bonds may have tightened within smaller groups, becoming more reliant on daily cooperation than on periodic large gatherings. Trust was reinforced not by shared spectacle, but by shared work. Repairing tools, preparing food, caring for children and elders. These actions, repeated quietly, held communities together as effectively as any carved pillar once had. Memory, too, adjusted its scale. Without a monumental place to revisit, remembering may have become more personal and relational. Stories were anchored to people rather than locations. Knowledge lived in hands and habits. When someone showed another how to shape stone, track animals, or recognize the right moment to harvest wild grains, they were also passing on a sense of continuity. The past was not distant. It was present in practice. This kind of life leaves fewer obvious traces for archaeologists to recover. Hearths are scattered, campsites overlap lightly, objects are used until they disappear back into the ground. From a modern perspective, it can seem as though something has been lost. But for those living then, daily existence may not have felt diminished. It may have felt more intimate, more closely tied to immediate surroundings. Ritual did not require architecture. It could exist in timing, in repetition, in shared silence, a moment before a hunt, a pause at dusk, a pattern of movement repeated year after year. Such acts do not announce themselves to history. They blend seamlessly into life, making it difficult for us to separate the sacred from the practical. As populations remained relatively small and mobile, the landscape itself served as a living archive. Paths remembered generations of footsteps. Seasonal returns reinforced a sense of belonging without fixed settlement. Even as people began to spend longer periods in particular places, movement remained familiar, not threatening. Staying and leaving were part of the same rhythm. What we see after the closure of large ritual centers is not an absence of organization, but a redistribution of attention. Meaning spread outward, becoming less concentrated, less visible, and perhaps more resilient. Without dependence on a single place, communities could adapt to environmental shifts with flexibility. If resources changed in one area, memory of other places remained. This period challenges modern expectations about progress. There is no clear marker announcing a new stage, no moment that demands to be labeled. Instead, there is continuity shaped by adjustment. Life proceeds, attentive to subtle changes rather than dramatic turns. And it is within this understated persistence that we begin to glimpse the broader archaeological context surrounding these communities, where evidence is sparse, quiet, and easily overlooked, yet deeply informative about how humans lived between monuments and memories. That broader archaeological context, quiet and easily overlooked, asks us to slow down even further, to read absence not as failure, but as a different kind of presence. After places like Göbekli Tepe were closed, the material record becomes thinner, more scattered, and harder to interpret. Yet this thinning is itself meaningful. It reflects lives lived with fewer fixed points, spread gently across the land. Archaeologically, this period is marked by modest traces. Small campsites appear and disappear. Stone tools show continuity rather than innovation. Hearths are rebuilt in similar ways across generations. There is no clear signal of disruption. Instead, there is repetition. Familiar forms persist, suggesting that people were not seeking to reinvent their world, but to maintain it under changing circumstances. This is where modern expectations can mislead us. We are trained to look for escalation, larger settlements, denser populations, more elaborate objects. When those signals do not appear, it is tempting to imagine loss or decline. But the evidence does not demand that interpretation. What it suggests instead is selectivity. Communities did not abandon complexity, they expressed it differently. Imagine standing on a low rise in southeastern Anatolia at dawn. The air is cool. Below you, the land opens into shallow valleys and rolling hills. There is no single place that draws the eye, no monument breaking the horizon. Instead, there are many subtle landmarks, each known to someone, each holding a story that does not need stone to endure. In such a world, social life would have been calibrated to smaller scales. Groups could come together and separate with relative ease. Knowledge did not need to be centralized. It circulated through visits, marriages, seasonal movements, and shared tasks. This circulation left few durable marks, but it was effective. It allowed continuity without concentration. Material culture reflects this balance. Tools remain efficient rather than decorative. Objects are shaped for use, not display. There is little emphasis on accumulation. Items are repaired, reused, and eventually left behind without ceremony. This does not indicate a lack of meaning. It indicates confidence that meaning does not reside in things alone. Environmental evidence supports this reading. Climate conditions during this period were variable but not catastrophic. Resources shifted gradually. Wild grains expanded in some areas, retreated in others. Animal populations adjusted their ranges. Human groups responded by adjusting movement and timing, not by abandoning familiar strategies. Flexibility, rather than transformation, seems to have been the guiding principle. Importantly, the practices that would later be recognized as agriculture did not appear suddenly here. They existed as part of a broader relationship with the landscape. People encouraged certain plants, returned to productive areas, and learned to anticipate seasonal cycles. These actions did not require a radical change in worldview. They fit comfortably within existing patterns of attention and care. Ritual, too, leaves faint traces. Without large structures, it becomes archaeologically elusive. But repetition itself can be ritualized. The same camp used at the same time of year. The same route followed generation after generation. These patterns do not announce themselves as sacred, but they can carry deep significance. What emerges from this context is a picture of human life that is neither stalled nor accelerating. It is adjusting. The closure of monumental sites did not create a void. It revealed a capacity for meaning that did not depend on scale. People continued to live richly textured lives, even if those textures are difficult for us to recover. And as we move forward, this understated archaeological landscape invites us to consider a deeper question: why large ritual centers were needed at all, and what their quiet disappearance tells us about the rhythms of human gathering and separation that continue to shape societies long after the stones are gone. Those rhythms of gathering and separation, hinted at by the quiet disappearance of monumental centers, deserve careful attention. Large ritual sites did not vanish because people forgot how to build them. They faded because the conditions that made them useful shifted slowly and without announcement. Understanding this requires us to think less about events and more about balance. For a time, places like Göbekli Tepe served as points of convergence. They gathered people who otherwise lived dispersed lives. They coordinated memory across distance. They offered moments when many individuals could align their sense of belonging. But such convergence requires energy, surplus time, and shared motivation. When daily life begins to absorb those needs more locally, the draw of a distant center naturally weakens. This weakening does not imply dissatisfaction or rejection. It suggests sufficiency. Smaller-scale rituals embedded in daily routines may have met social and emotional needs just as effectively. When meaning is already present in the rhythms of work, movement, and seasonal return, the necessity of extraordinary gathering diminishes. Archaeologically, this transition appears subtle. There is no layer of ash or destruction, no abrupt abandonment. Instead, we see careful infilling, deliberate closure. This act itself implies respect, a recognition that the place had served its purpose. Closing a site in this way preserves it, sealing memory rather than erasing it. Such behavior hints at a cultural comfort with impermanence. Structures did not need to last forever to be meaningful. Their value lay in use, not endurance. When their role was complete, they could be allowed to rest. This attitude contrasts sharply with later monumental traditions, where permanence becomes a statement of power or continuity. Here, continuity was carried elsewhere. Daily life absorbed ritual in quiet ways. The timing of activities mattered. The repetition of certain actions mattered. Teaching mattered. A child learning when to gather plants or how to prepare food was also learning how the world worked. These lessons reinforced social bonds without requiring spectacle. Knowledge transmission became an everyday act. This period also suggests a different relationship to leadership and authority. Without central places that required coordination on a large scale, influence likely remained situational and temporary. Skill, experience, and trust mattered more than position. Decisions were made close to where their consequences would be felt. This proximity reduced the need for centralized control. Importantly, none of this required a break with the past. People did not abandon their ancestors or traditions. They carried them forward in forms that suited changing circumstances. Stories adapted. Practices shifted emphasis. What endured was not a specific structure, but a way of relating to the world that valued attentiveness and flexibility. From our distance, it can be tempting to read this as a step backward or a pause before something else begins. But such framing imposes direction where there may have been none. Life did not wait for the next stage. It continued, attentive and sufficient in itself. As we move deeper into this story, the quiet choices made during this period begin to stand out, not as absences, but as alternatives. Alternatives to monumentality, alternatives to centralization. And these alternatives open space to consider the anomaly itself more carefully, asking why such large ritual centers emerged when they did, and why they could be so calmly left behind. That calm leaving behind of monumental centers leads us directly into the anomaly itself, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a condition to be understood. Large ritual sites like Göbekli Tepe stand out precisely because they interrupt an otherwise consistent pattern of dispersed living. They were unusual, not because early humans lacked meaning without them, but because meaning was usually carried in quieter ways. The anomaly is not that such places existed, it is that they were temporary. They appear, function intensively for a time, and then are deliberately set aside. This suggests that monumentality was not an inevitable destination. It was a response to particular social conditions that could arise and fade without leaving lasting institutional structures behind. One possibility is that these centers helped manage moments of heightened connection, periods when populations increased slightly, when climatic stability allowed more predictable gathering, or when shared concerns required broader coordination. In such moments, gathering at a single place could reinforce shared identity. It could synchronize stories, symbols, and expectations across groups that otherwise spent much of the year apart. But synchronization does not need to be permanent. Once alignment was achieved, once relationships were renewed and knowledge shared, the need for a central stage diminished. People returned to their smaller worlds, carrying with them the memory of having been part of something larger. The monument did not need to remain active to continue shaping behavior. This perspective reframes the closing of such sites. Rather than seeing it as abandonment, we can see it as completion, a recognition that the work had been done. The careful burial of structures may reflect an understanding that reopening them would be unnecessary or even inappropriate once their role had passed. The anomaly also invites us to reconsider how we think about social complexity. Complexity does not require permanence. It does not demand visible hierarchy or continuous growth. It can arise episodically, intensify briefly, and then dissolve back into everyday life. This kind of complexity is harder for us to detect because it leaves fewer durable traces, but it may have been more common than we assume. Importantly, this does not mean that people were indifferent to scale or coordination. They clearly understood how to organize labor, how to share symbolic language, and how to invest time in collective projects. The choice not to sustain these projects indefinitely reflects restraint rather than limitation. It suggests an awareness of balance between collective effort and daily necessity. This balance may also explain why the transition toward more settled lifeways unfolds so gradually. Practices associated with tending plants, managing animals, and staying longer in one place could expand without demanding new monumental expressions. These practices fit comfortably within smaller social units. They reinforced continuity rather than spectacle. As people began to spend more time in particular areas, the need for distant gathering points lessened further. Local knowledge deepened. Familiar landscapes grew richer with memory. Ritual adapted to place rather than drawing people away from it. The anomaly of large ritual centers became less relevant, not because it failed, but because it was no longer required. From this angle, the story after Göbekli Tepe is not about loss of ambition or imagination. It is about sufficiency, about recognizing when intensity can give way to steadiness. The absence of new monuments does not indicate a lack of creativity. It indicates that creativity was being expressed elsewhere, in relationships, routines, and subtle environmental management. This reading also tempers modern narratives of inevitability. There was no straight path leading from monumentality to agriculture to cities. There were many viable ways to live, and communities selected among them based on immediate needs rather than abstract futures. Large ritual centers were one option among many, not a threshold that had to be crossed. As we continue, this understanding allows us to explore interpretive possibilities without forcing conclusions. It opens space to ask how humans navigate between gathering and dispersal, between shared intensity and everyday continuity. And it prepares us to consider how meaning adapts when it no longer needs to be reinforced by stone, but by the quieter persistence of lived experience. That quieter persistence of lived experience brings us back to daily life itself, where adaptation unfolds without declaration. After the period of large ritual centers, the human world did not feel empty. It felt distributed, meaning effort and attention were spread across many moments rather than concentrated in a few. This redistribution shaped how people related to time, place, and one another. Adaptation here did not require new identities. People did not need to redefine who they were. They continued to hunt, gather, tend, and return. What shifted was emphasis. More energy was invested locally. Seasonal rhythms became slightly more predictable as familiarity with particular landscapes deepened. These changes accumulated slowly, without creating a sense of rupture. In this setting, innovation often took the form of refinement rather than invention. Tools became better suited to repeated tasks in familiar environments. Knowledge of plant cycles grew more precise. People learned which patches responded well to attention and which did not. This attentiveness did not announce itself as a new way of life. It felt like learning to listen more closely. Social organization adapted in parallel. Smaller groups meant that cooperation was immediate and visible. Roles were flexible. Authority remained contextual. A person's influence depended on situation, experience, and trust rather than fixed status. Such systems do not scale easily, but they are resilient. They adjust quickly to change because they are embedded in relationships rather than institutions. Ritual followed the same logic. Without large centers, it could be woven into daily practice. Certain tasks might be done in specific sequences. Certain times of day or year might carry quiet significance. These patterns did not require explanation. They were known because they were lived. Their meaning was reinforced through repetition rather than spectacle. This period also invites us to reconsider how memory operates. Without monumental reminders, memory becomes active rather than passive. It must be carried, told, enacted. Stories change subtly as they pass between people, adapting to context. This does not weaken them. It allows them to remain relevant. Memory becomes something that moves with people rather than something that waits for them. From an archaeological perspective, this mobility of meaning is challenging. It resists clear categorization. It leaves behind only fragments. But those fragments, when read patiently, suggest continuity rather than fragmentation. They suggest that people were comfortable living without constant reinforcement of identity through place. Importantly, this comfort does not imply simplicity. Lives were still structured by obligation, expectation, and shared understanding. Children learned by watching. Adults negotiated access to resources. Elders carried experience that mattered. These dynamics did not disappear with monumentality. They were redistributed across more intimate settings. As attention turned inward toward local landscapes, people's relationship with the environment likely grew more reciprocal. Repeated presence allowed observation of subtle changes. A patch of ground that responded well one year could be returned to the next. An animal route could be anticipated. These interactions did not require ownership. They required familiarity. Over time, such familiarity could lead to longer stays and more investment in particular places. But even here, movement remained an option. Staying was not yet a commitment to permanence. It was a response to conditions that felt favorable. Leaving remained equally acceptable when circumstances changed. This balance between staying and moving, between intensification and dispersal, defines the adaptive character of this period. It resists tidy labels. It cannot be easily framed as progress or decline. It is better understood as calibration, a continual adjustment of life to land, of memory to practice. As we move forward, this calibrated world invites us to consider not just how people lived, but how they thought about continuity itself. What does it mean to belong to a lineage, a place, or a way of life when none of it is fixed in stone? That question leads us gently into the interpretive possibilities that follow. That question of belonging, carried without stone anchors, opens a space for interpretation rather than conclusion. It allows us to imagine how people may have understood continuity when permanence was not a goal. One possibility is that continuity was felt through movement itself, through return rather than residence, through familiarity rather than fixation. Picture a small group arriving at a place they have known before. The ground shows faint traces of earlier fires. Stones lie where they were last left. Nothing announces importance, yet everything feels recognized. The place does not need to be named or marked. Its meaning emerges simply through being there again. In such moments, continuity is not abstract. It is physical and immediate. The body remembers what the land expects, where to walk, where to pause, where to look. Belonging arises not from ownership, but from repeated interaction. This kind of belonging can survive dispersal because it does not depend on proximity to others all the time. It depends on shared understanding of how to move through the world. Interpretively, this suggests that large ritual centers were not the sole or even primary containers of identity. They were amplifiers. They intensified connections that already existed. When those amplifiers were no longer needed, identity did not dissolve. It returned to its quieter baseline, embedded in everyday competence and shared habit. Another possibility is that the closing of monumental sites reflected a deliberate preference for balance. Large gatherings can strengthen bonds, but they can also strain resources and attention. Maintaining them indefinitely may have felt unnecessary or even undesirable once social alignment had been achieved. Letting go could have been an act of care rather than neglect. This perspective shifts how we think about social memory. Memory did not need to be fixed to remain powerful. It could be refreshed through practice, through teaching, through the simple act of doing things the way they had always been done, while remaining open to small adjustments. Change, in this context, was not a threat to memory. It was part of how memory stayed alive. Such a worldview does not produce sharp boundaries between past and present. Ancestors are present in techniques, in roots, in timing. The future is not imagined as fundamentally different, but as an extension of what already works. Innovation happens, but it is absorbed gently, without demanding redefinition. From this angle, the absence of new monuments after Göbekli Tepe is not a silence. It is a shift in expression. Meaning did not retreat. It redistributed itself across bodies, landscapes, and routines. This redistribution made societies less visible to us, but perhaps more adaptable for those living within them. It also suggests that humans have long been capable of choosing restraint, of stepping back from intensification when it no longer serves. This choice does not require foresight or ideology. It can emerge organically from lived experience. When daily life feels sufficient, there is little incentive to build beyond it. As we consider these possibilities, it becomes clear that interpretation must remain open. The evidence allows for multiple readings, none of which demand collapse, revolution, or inevitability. What it consistently supports is continuity shaped by choice, circumstance, and quiet preference. And it is this continuity, extended across generations without monumental reinforcement, that brings us toward a deeper reflection on how human lifeways persist through subtle transitions, carrying forward not through grand gestures, but through the patient accumulation of ordinary days. That patient accumulation of ordinary days invites one more interpretive turn. If continuity was maintained without monuments, then perhaps meaning itself was understood as something inherently temporary, yet renewable, not fixed in form, but sustained through attention. In this light, the closing of large ritual centers becomes less an ending and more a release. Imagine standing at the edge of a familiar seasonal camp as evening settles in. There are no markers to distinguish this place from others nearby, yet the timing feels right. The group knows when to stop working, when to gather, when to rest. Nothing signals ritual, but the rhythm itself carries significance. Such scenes suggest that ritual and daily life may not have been sharply separated. The act of returning, of preparing, of sharing food could hold the same weight once carried by monumental gatherings. Meaning did not require amplification, it required participation. This kind of ritual is nearly invisible to archaeology, yet it may have been deeply satisfying to those who lived it. Interpreting the period after Göbekli Tepe this way helps us resist the temptation to search for replacement monuments or new centers. The absence of such structures does not imply a gap that needed filling. It implies that the need itself had changed. Social cohesion was maintained through other means, quieter but no less effective. This also reframes how we think about social learning. Without centralized spaces for collective display, learning became more distributed. Skills were passed in context. Knowledge was reinforced through repetition rather than ceremony. This method of transmission favors adaptability. It allows practices to adjust subtly as conditions shift without breaking continuity. Environmental engagement likely deepened under these conditions. Spending more time in familiar areas encourages observation. People learn not just where resources are, but how they respond over time. This relationship fosters care without formal ownership. It supports a form of management that is responsive rather than directive. Such responsiveness may explain why this period does not show clear signs of stress, despite gradual changes in climate and resource availability. Flexibility was built into the system. Movement remained possible. Staying remained optional. This balance reduced vulnerability to localized disruption. From a modern perspective, it can be difficult to accept that societies might choose not to intensify. That stability without growth could be desirable. Yet, the archaeological record here does not contradict that possibility. It quietly supports it. Lives appear organized around sufficiency rather than expansion. This does not mean that aspirations were absent. It means they were scaled to lived experience. The future did not need to be fundamentally different from the present to be meaningful. Improvement could occur through refinement, through learning, through better attunement to land and community. As we move toward the later phases of this story, this interpretive space remains intentionally open. What matters is not selecting a single explanation, but recognizing the range of human possibility it reveals. After the stones were covered, life did not lose its structure. It found it elsewhere. And from here, our attention turns toward a longer view, where this quiet continuity stretches forward across generations, shaping how humans would later remember, settle, and adapt, even as their worlds slowly changed around them. That longer view, stretching forward beyond the covering of stones, reveals how quiet continuity can shape human experience over generations without announcing itself as change. What follows is not a new phase marked by innovation, but an extended period in which accumulated adjustments begin to feel like tradition. Life carries on, and in doing so, it slowly transforms the conditions of its own persistence. As people remained attentive to familiar landscapes, their presence left subtle marks. Paths became easier to follow. Certain clearings were returned to more often. Hearths were rebuilt in roughly the same places. None of this required planning across generations. It emerged naturally from repetition. Over time, these repetitions created a sense of rootedness that did not depend on permanent structures. This rootedness did not eliminate movement. Instead, it balanced it. People could stay longer without feeling confined. They could leave without feeling displaced. Belonging was flexible, distributed across places rather than tied to a single location. This flexibility may have been one of the most enduring strengths of these societies, allowing them to navigate gradual environmental and social shifts with minimal disruption. Memory played a central role in maintaining this balance. Without monuments to externalize it, memory had to remain active. It was reinforced through shared experience rather than fixed narrative. Stories were likely less about origins and more about patterns, when to return, when to wait, when to move on. These stories did not need to be preserved unchanged. Their value lay in guidance, not accuracy. Over generations, such guidance could support increasingly regular engagement with particular plants and animals, not as a deliberate strategy, but as a consequence of familiarity. When people know a place well, they notice what responds to care. They notice which actions lead to abundance and which do not. This knowledge accumulates quietly, embedded in practice rather than theory. What we later recognize as more settled lifeways can be seen emerging from this depth of familiarity. But at the time, these changes may not have felt significant. Spending more time in one place did not require abandoning older patterns. It simply meant adjusting their frequency. The past remained present even as new routines formed. Importantly, this process does not suggest inevitability. It may suggest possibility. One path among many that could be taken depending on conditions. In some areas, mobility likely remained dominant. In others, longer stays became more practical. The diversity of responses reflects a world not moving in unison, but in parallel, shaped by local circumstances. Social memory helped maintain coherence across this diversity. Even as groups adapted differently, shared practices and understandings allowed recognition and connection. Meetings between groups could still occur. Knowledge could still circulate. Differences did not imply separation. They were variations within a broadly shared way of being human. From this perspective, the period after Göbekli Tepe does not lead toward a destination. It opens outward. It shows how societies can remain stable while allowing change to accumulate slowly at the edges. Stability here does not mean stasis. It means continuity that is flexible enough to absorb difference without fracture. As we continue toward the final reflections, this quiet adaptability invites us to reconsider how we define endurance. Not as permanence, but as the ability to carry meaning forward without needing to fix it in place. That ability, refined over generations, would shape human experience long after the memory of stone circles had faded into earth. That ability to carry meaning forward without fixing it in place becomes clearer when we consider how environmental and social transitions unfolded together. Not as paired revolutions, but as overlapping adjustments that rarely aligned perfectly. Landscapes changed gradually, so did human responses. Neither waited for the other. Climatic patterns in this long span were not stable, but they were not catastrophic either. Shifts in rainfall, temperature, and seasonality altered where resources were most reliable. Some areas became more attractive for longer stays, others less so. Human groups did not need to interpret these changes abstractly. They felt them through daily practice, through success and failure, through ease and difficulty. Because social organization remained flexible, these environmental changes did not demand uniform solutions. A group could respond by staying longer, another by moving more often. Neither choice required a break from tradition. Both could be justified through existing knowledge. This diversity of response is important. It suggests that continuity did not require sameness. As some communities spent more time in particular places, their relationship with those places deepened. Memory layered itself onto landscape, not through markers, but through familiarity. Certain spots became associated with successful seasons, others with caution. These associations did not need to be formalized. They lived in expectation. Over time, this kind of environmental memory could support more regular engagement with specific resources, not because of a desire to control, but because of trust built through experience. When you return to the same place often enough, you learn its rhythms. You learn when it gives easily and when it does not. This learning encourages care without requiring ownership. Social memory worked in parallel. Knowledge of how to live well in a place became part of identity, but not in an exclusionary sense. It was something shared with those who learned it. Outsiders could become insiders through participation. This openness allowed ideas and practices to circulate even as local adaptations took shape. What emerges here is a form of continuity that does not resist change, but absorbs it. Change does not threaten identity because identity is not rigid. It is procedural. It exists in how things are done, rather than in what things are called. This makes it remarkably durable. In this light, the later appearance of more permanent settlements does not negate what came before. It builds upon it. The skills required to stay in one place for longer periods were learned during times when staying was optional. Familiarity preceded commitment. Knowledge came before investment. This sequence matters because it challenges narratives that frame early human history as a series of thresholds. What we see instead is layering. New practices accumulate without erasing old ones. Movement remains possible, even as staying becomes more common. Memory stretches to accommodate both. As generations passed, the distance from monumental centers like Göbekli Tepe increased, not just in time, but in relevance. Younger generations did not need to know those places directly. What mattered was how to live now. The past survived not as a location, but as competence, and it is here, in this long, unremarkable stretch of adaptation, that we begin to sense the depth of human continuity. A continuity that does not announce itself, does not demand recognition, but quietly persists. From this foundation, we can turn toward the final reflections, where the absence of monuments becomes not a loss, but a lens through which to reconsider what it means for a way of life to endure. That lens, shaped by absence rather than presence, invites a quieter kind of reflection. When monuments fall silent and do not return, we are left with lives that carried on without leaving clear signatures of ambition or finality. This does not diminish them. It asks us to adjust how we listen. From a distance of thousands of years, it can be difficult to accept that much of human history unfolded without clear markers, without statements carved into stone, without structures meant to outlast their builders. Yet, for those living through this long continuity, endurance did not require visibility. It required balance. Balance between effort and return, between memory and forgetting, between staying and moving on. These balances were not calculated, they were felt. They emerged through daily negotiation with land, weather, and one another. When something no longer served, it could be released without crisis. When something worked, it could be repeated without fanfare. In this way, the closing of large ritual centers becomes part of a broader human capacity, the ability to let practices rest without losing their meaning. The stones did not need to remain active for their influence to persist. What they had coordinated had already been absorbed into social life. Once absorbed, it no longer required reinforcement. This perspective encourages restraint in interpretation. It reminds us that significance does not always correspond to scale. That meaning can be deeply held without being externally displayed. The archaeological quiet of this period may reflect not a lack of cultural richness, but a form of richness that resists material capture. It also invites humility. Much of what mattered most to these communities may be permanently beyond our reach. Their moments of recognition, their pauses, their shared understandings, these things leave little trace, yet they shaped lives just as decisively as any monument. What we can observe is continuity without insistence, traditions that adapt without announcing themselves as change, knowledge that survives by being useful rather than revered. This kind of continuity does not depend on memory being preserved exactly. It depends on memory remaining responsive. As later periods introduce new forms of settlement, new relationships with land, and eventually new kinds of monuments, it is worth remembering that these developments did not emerge from absence. They emerged from this deep foundation of quiet competence, from generations who learned how to live without needing to define their lives through lasting structures. Perhaps this is one of the enduring lessons of the time after Göbekli Tepe, that human societies are capable of stepping away from intensity without losing coherence, that they can distribute meaning across everyday life and still remain connected, that they can endure without needing to be seen. As we approach the final movement of this story, the question is no longer what was lost when the stones were covered. It is what was carried forward, quietly and persistently, into worlds that would one day look very different on the surface, but remain deeply familiar in rhythm and need. What was carried forward, quietly and persistently, is not a single practice or belief, but a way of being human that does not depend on permanence to endure. In the long span after Göbekli Tepe, life continued without announcement, shaped by habits that proved sufficient for their time. These habits did not seek to define the future. They simply met the present. From this distance, it can be tempting to imagine that something unfinished was left behind. That monumentality, once discovered, should have continued. But the evidence allows for another reading. One possibility is that people learned they did not need to return to such intensity in order to live meaningful lives. They had already absorbed what those gatherings offered. Meaning, in this view, became portable. It moved with people as they moved across familiar ground. It lived in timing, in recognition, in shared expectation. It did not require reinforcement through scale. It required attention. This attentiveness, cultivated over generations, became one of humanity's most reliable tools. As landscapes changed and populations slowly grew or shifted, this attentiveness allowed adaptation without rupture. New practices could be integrated without erasing old ones. Staying longer in one place did not invalidate the knowledge of moving on. The past remained useful because it was not fixed. Perhaps this is why the transition toward more settled lives feels so gradual in the archaeological record. Not because people hesitated, but because there was no urgency. Life was already working. Change could be absorbed at a pace that did not threaten continuity. In the absence of monuments, time itself became the archive. Knowledge was stored in repetition, in seasonal return, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing how to live well enough. This archive does not survive intact, but its effects do. They are visible in the ease with which later societies would adopt new forms of living without completely severing their ties to older ways. The world after Göbekli Tepe was not defined by what it lacked. It was defined by what it no longer needed. Large ritual centers had served their moment. What followed was not lesser, but different, more distributed, more intimate, more adaptable. As we sit with this long continuity, the story settles into stillness. There is no final transformation to announce, no conclusion to draw, only the recognition that much of human history has unfolded this way, quietly, without spectacle, sustained by ordinary days that, taken together, carried meaning forward across deep time. And in that quiet endurance, we may find a gentler understanding of our own place in history, not as inheritors of monuments alone, but as participants in a much older rhythm, one that knows how to continue even when the stones are finally covered and the land returns to silence.